CEU Medieval Radio, Past Perfect, the talk show about medieval and early modern culture.
Hello and welcome to Past Perfect, the CEU Medieval Radio's podcast on everything medieval and early modern. My name is Michał Machalski, and I'm joined here today by Éloïse Adde, who joined CEU's Medieval Department's faculty in 2021. She earned her PhD at Paris Sorbonne in 2011 with her thesis on Dalimil's Chronicle and the beginning of the Czech national historiography in the vernacular language. After working at several research institutes in Prague, Frankfurt and Berlin, she led a research project on the Europe of the Luxembourg dynasty, governance, delegation and participation between region and empire, 1308 to 1437. Her ongoing Marie Skłodowska-Curie Fellowship focuses on the emergence of the nation in Europe by comparing urbanized Brabant and feudal Bohemia between 1300 and 1450. Alice, it's very nice to have you here. My first question would be, most people, at least here in Central Europe, first are told during the primary education that their nation is ancient and unchanging from Middle Ages to 21st century, only to learn later that nationhood is modern, 19th century phenomenon. Is there then a medieval nation, and if so, how does it look like and how is it different from a modern state?
Yes, you are right. In France too, we can observe that the primary education tends to create a false, artificial, but also evident continuity between the medieval populations and polities, while the university teaching and more generally academia situates the birth of nation and nationhood in the 19th century, so after the US and the French revolutions. And this corresponds also to an evolution in the field of the history of the nation. The 19th century marks the beginning of the history as an autonomous discipline, and this period also corresponds to a set of political and social changes. It is the triumph, we can say, of the nation-state at that time. The nation became the norm in the organization, political and social, at least, organization. And everywhere we can observe in the 19th century the use of history and of the anciency of the nations in order to consolidate these new states, we can say, of the 19th century. And historians who also very, very often belong to the bourgeoisie of that time. So the social category who profited from these changes at least contributed to this. So you have really, we can say, a meeting of interest at that time. And in the 70s of the 20th century, a change. Historians became aware of this manipulation, we can say. And so they realized that this history at least was conceived to serve the consolidation of the state, and that it was not the real history of the nation. And the medievalists began to be cautious about the concept of the nation. What is right? But at the same time, when we look at the sources from the medieval period, we can see that the nation already exists. I will have the opportunity to speak about that. And so that's why I'm working on it.
How then this idea of medieval nation manifested itself in medieval times, especially in the place that is at the center of your research interest, mainly the domains of the Luxembourg dynasty and of the most important, but perhaps not as widely known, ruling families of High and Late Middle Ages? First, for our listeners' sake, who are Luxembourgs and where do they come from?
This is an important question because we will speak many times about them. So the Luxembourg was the ruling dynasty of the county of Luxembourg, which is a small county between actual Belgium, France and Germany. And so this family exists from the 10th century, but it became important when it succeeded in unifying the county under its rule, so at the 12th, 13th century. And yes, it was very important at that time. They became a very important family, competing with the Brabantine dynasty, which was also were competing for the control of the trade routes between the two major rivers, so Meuse and Rhine. And in 1288, the Duke of Brabant, John I, was victorious on the Count of Luxembourg, but still with So this was an important moment in the history of the Luxembourg dynasty because all the count died at that time, and a lot of his brothers died also. So it was a moment of trouble for the county, for the dynasty, but still the bonds with the kings of France were very important. So Henry VII then is ruling after Henry VI at the end of the 13th century, and he had been educated at the court of Philippe le Bel, the king of France. And this family had also the support of Clement V. So it's very interesting because when you look at this family, it looks like it's a small country, but at least it was this family that has the intersection of many countries and many powers and had many links to many families. And when Albert I of Habsburg died in 1308, it was not difficult, at least for Henry VII to be elected. So as I said, he had the support of Pope Clement V. And among the electors for the dignity of the King of the Romans, you had his brother, Baudouin of Luxembourg, who was Archbishop of Trier, and Peter of Aspelt, his advisor, who was also Archbishop of Mainz. So at least they were not so important, but they had very good connections, and at that time they also represented an alternative to the Habsburgs. So at least all the electors agreed to elect Henry VII, the new king of the Romans, and it was a very important step in the history of that dynasty.
Right, so Henry VII became the king of the Romans, but he comes from the dynasty whose holdings are primarily located by Rhine, near the Brabant, and your thesis and a lot of your research focuses on Bohemia, right, which is on completely other side of the empire. So maybe you can tell us, how do the Luxembourgs come to rule in Bohemia, and what was the socio-political situation there at the time?
This election, Henry VII was elected the king of the Romans. It represented a new configuration of empire, and it was a very important step, as I said, for the Luxembourg dynasty. At the same time, in Bohemia occurred a succession crisis. The last Premeslead, Wenceslas III, died. He had been assassinated, and he died without descent in 1306. And Albert of Habsburg, who was still the king of the Romans at that time, instated his son Rodolphe as the new king. But he died, Rodolphe died very soon, and after his unexpected death in 1307, his successor, Henry of Carinthia, had proven unable to create unanimity and to rule the kingdom. And the important problem was that he was also all the time requiring the help of foreign princes like the Margrave of Meissen. So it generated a lot of troubles in Bohemia. And the Czech abbots and lords then decided to negotiate with Henry VII in order to find a solution. And they decided together to elect John, the son, so Henry VII's son, the new king of Bohemia. It's a very important moment because this situation was the opportunity to stage at least the sense of the nation and the need to protect its integrity from the part of the Czech abbots. This reaction against Henry de Carinthia was justified as really the need to make something to protect the integrity of Bohemia because of this permanent intrusion of foreign forces in the country. So it was the justification. And this negotiations between Henry VII and the Czech delegation very well illustrate, again, the meeting of many perspectives and interests. The Czech historiography traditionally opposes Henry's, VII, and Albert of Habsburg behaviors. In reality, both intervened as kings of the Romans and the suzerains of the Czechs. But the difference is that Albert used the first to instead his son in 1306, while Henry of Luxembourg benefited from the nobles and abbots initiative. And so Henry had to make some concessions. He would have preferred to send his brother Valéran as king of Bohemia, but the Czechs objected. They wanted rather to have his son because they thought that as a young man it would be easier to manipulate him. And the newly elected king of Bohemia, John, had to accept many demands from the nobility in the form of the inaugural diplomas. For instance, he had to name only Czechs to the principal offices and as members of his council. And what I would like to point concerning this negotiation is that it's very well illustrates how two groups, two powers, we can say, which didn't have the same view, could at least at that moment converge. Henry the Seventh, although he had to make some concessions, he acted as the king of the Romans, as the suzerain of the Czechs, and the Czechs could also say that they at least elected their new king, when in reality the decision came from the king of the Romans. But it gave some foundation to the nobility, which at that moment decided to formalize its position in the decision making and also to embody the nation.
Speaking about Bohemian nobility, I believe that one of the texts you're an expert on, the Dalimil Chronicle, is a very important contemporary source on the position in which Bohemian nobles found themselves at the dawn of the 14th century. So, can you tell us more about how this source illustrates this position? What is this about and what makes it interesting?
Yes, the Dalimil Chronicle is the first chronicle written in Czech, so that's a very important moment for the construction of the Czech identity, and it's also the second literary text after the Alexandrida, which is an adaptation of the Alexander romances by Guillaume de Châtillon and Ulrich von Elzenbach. The author is anonymous, but we still call him Dalimil, and it seems so he appears like a very well-educated person. He had maybe a clerical education, but what is clear is that he really embodies the interests of the Czech nobility. This text was written around 1309, 1310, and the last chapter ends with the advent of John of Luxembourg, so this moment I just described, and it recalls the whole history of the country from the beginnings. That means from the legions and the foundation legions of Bohemia, and it also connects the history of Bohemia with biblical events. And yes, it was written during this context of permanent instability under John of Carinthia. Yeah, this context seems to have been the impulse for writing this chronicle, and especially a moment in 1309 when the burghers of Prague and Kutná-Hora, the two main cities of Bohemia, coordinated their action and kidnapped the main leaders of the Czech nobility. So the upper class of the bourgeoisie at that time hoped to gain some political recognition from this maneuver, this kidnapping. Their enterprises failed, but it materialized the force of this group. This kidnapping of the main Czech nobles appears to have been the impulse for writing for Dalimil, because in his message of Dalimil, we can see two major preoccupations: the rise of the German bourgeoisie and the absolutist tendencies of the king's power. Bohemia had become a kingdom in 1198, and according to Dalimil, this marked a considerable break. According to him, the king ceased at that moment to govern with the nobility, and the nobility became lazy and abandoned their duties. And yes, what is interesting in Dalimil's message is that he's connecting different elements together. According to him, so you have this break because the duke became a king, so he's not anymore the primus inter pares. The nobility is not working with him. The king is favoring the Germans. The German community is growing because of the arriving of German in the context of the so-called German colonization. And this bourgeoisie is competing with the nobility, and as the nobility is becoming weak, it is not able to react. And so Dalimil's chronicle is an appeal to the nobility to be aware of its duty and to act in order to preserve the integrity of the country.
Is this the reason why it is written in Czech?
Yes, it is connected with the rise of this German community in Bohemia. And at that point, it's important to recall also the linguistic situation of Bohemia, because the first vernacularization did not occur in Czech, but in German. And it's something which is still today problematic. This German written literature is quite forgotten, or is not presented as so important as it was. But yes, during the 13th century, Prague had become one of the most flourishing centers of German culture under Przemysl Ottokar II, but also then under Wenceslas II, who himself wrote several poems in German. And Ulrich von Etzenbach, for example, one of the most important German writers at that time, wrote his Alexander at the court of Przemysl Ottokar II. So that's something very important. Bohemia was a part of the Holy Empire, and the German culture was the dominating culture. Many Czech noble families had Germanized their name to follow this new fashion. Rosenberg, for example, like Rosenberg or Lemberg, they took some German name. And it's interesting that Dalimil in his chronicle used Czech instead of German name. For instance, he calls the lords of Lemberg the lords of Jablonne, or the lords of Falkenstein, Smezejice. So he's trying to change this reality. And yes, through his chronicle, Dalimil aims at putting an end to this tendency, this fashion of the German language. And yes, language is a perfect tool for him to invalidate this situation and mainly the German community. To illustrate that, it's important to signalize that Dalimil even uses the word jazyk, so tongue, language, to refer to the nation. Although the Latin tradition in Bohemia had so far preferred the word natio to lingua. If you look at the Latin chronicles, which were written before Dalimil wrote his one. And for Dalimil, the language and the community of speakers are one and the same. And those who do not speak it, so the Germans in Bohemia, are excluded from the jazyk, the nation, and even by the name that refers to them, because in Slavic languages, as you know, the word which designates Germans, so Niemcy, was made from the word niemi, which means silent. So you really see that even by the use of the words, the Germans have to be silent in the Czech nation.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
So how do those Germans who find themselves outside of the nation or tongue created by Dalimil react to said nation? Do they try to prove their belonging or propose some counter-narratives?
Yes, they reacted to that. Directly to Dalimil, we can mention two translations of Dalimil's chronicle. One made between 1346, and the second one written in 1444. But occurring in Dalimil's writing context, the first one is very interesting because his author made a lot of changes in his tradition. Each changed the vocabulary in a systematic way. In the Old Czech original, all Germans, whether they are from Bohemia or not, are referred to as Niemcy, so Germans. And Dalimil did not recognize the identity and existence of the so-called German Bohemian community, which at that time very strongly existed. However, the Germans living in Bohemia were not considered as foreigners by their contemporaries. So you have really different situation between Dalimil's view and what was the reality. And being German Bohemian himself, the author of the rhyme translation introduced a distinction between the two groups. And depending on the situation he translated, so the passages he translated, the word Niemcy was translated as Tutschin, for the Deutsch Böhmen, so these Germans from Bohemia, and as Fremd, foreign, in the case of Germans coming from abroad. So here you have the ethnical aspect, but Dalimil also wanted to invalidate also in a social way this German community, and he used, for example, indistinctly the word Hlap, Hlapove in plural, peasants, to designate all the non-nobles, and this word had a very pejorative connotation. And again, the translator does not simply translate chlap by peasant, but when it's the case, by Bürgin, that means burger, when the narrative clearly deals with burgers. So it doesn't accept this categorization imposed by Dalimil. And through this translation, the German community of Bohemia wanted to be recognized as a community of burghers, different from the German from abroad, and also from the peasants. And so, as a legitimate part of the whole community of land, deserved to get some political participation and not condemned to be silent.
Was it a popular work among the German burghers?
It's difficult to know. I must say that here we don't have enough documents to trace that. But maybe it was, as a second translation was written 1 century after, maybe there was this memory of a first translation which had been done and the need of adapt the message in order to replace the German community in the Czech lands.
I would like to return a little bit to Luxembourg and their domain, which stretches, of course, outside of Bohemia as well. Do you see similar processes of nation building in other parts? What are the local differences and what stays the same?
Yes, it's very interesting to come back to the Luxembourg domain because these domains at least composed what we can call a composite monarchy. Composite monarchies were the most common type of state in the pre-modern era, and they encompassed different countries and populations which conserved their rules, their laws, their languages, etc. So it was a patchwork of different polities, at least under the dominion of, so in this case, the king of the Romans or the emperor. And these composite monarchies, traditionally seen as an impediment of the development of the national idea, conformly to the requirement of congruence, identity between a polity and an ethnicity, according to Ernst Gellner. It is for him the requirement to have a nation. However, the Holy Empire, so here the Luxembourg domains, seems to have been an incubator of national sentiment. The coexistence between its imperial political culture and a fragmented territorial structure generated a strong desire for national assertiveness from the empire and the need to keep other nations born from the same process at bay. So at least each polity inside the empire wants to recuperate, to appropriate with imperial culture, and it gives birth to nations, but all these nations experience the same process, and at least by this competition try to assert themselves, so against the other nations, but also inside. So we can really observe in this domain other situations. So observe the development of national rhetoric, the local privileges against a foreign ruler in the Duchy of Luxembourg. So we don't have such texts like the Dalimil Chronicle in the Duchy of Luxembourg, but in the charters or in some deliberation, the idea of a Luxembourgish community nation is developed in order to protect some privileges. And what is interesting in such processes is not because you could say, yes, it's a rhetoric to defend some privileges, but at least by repeating always the same formulae, a definition of the community and of national sense, responsibility, still at least exists. And these processes, these very progressive processes are very interesting. But in my work, I rather compare the situation in Bohemia with that in Brabant, because here you have also the development of vernacular literature. So it can be compared to the situation in Bohemia, and in Brabant, the power of the towns had been strengthened by the privileges granted by Duke Henry II and Henry III in the 17th century. So you have also, like in Bohemia, you have this nobility which empowering. A similar process in Brabant is occurring, but it concerns the towns in this case. In 1312, John II issued the Charter of Kortenberg. So I won't go in the details of this text. It was at a moment also of troubles because he knew that he was sick, and he knew that his son would have problem to rule because he was also very young. So you have, like in Bohemia, the central power is challenged, and he needed the support of the town. So he issued this Charter of Kortenberg and provided through this charter for the establishment of a permanent council of control in which the urban representatives would have the majority. So like in Bohemia, you have structural changes. So the towns are very strong at that moment, but they need to consolidate this situation. And like in Bohemia, in Brabant, you have also the coexistence of two languages. The Flemish is the common language spoken by the population, but the French is also the language of the dominating culture. So the change was not so radical like in Bohemia, because in Bohemia, the writing of the Alexandrida and the Dalimil Chronicle was a radical break with what occurred before. The change was more progressive in Brabant. But yes, we can really observe a progressive intensification in writing in Flemish. And at the same time, so you have in Bohemia, the Dalimil's Chronicle, which was written in order to support the project of the nobility, and at the same time, the Chronicle of Jan van Boendel, so the Brabantse Geesten, written in order to support with new situation, with advent of the towns in the Duchy of Brabant. And what is here very interesting for me is that, and it's why I decided to dedicate a project and a monograph to this comparison, is that you can see that you have two groups which are traditionally presented as very different, so nobility in Bohemia and the towns in Brabant, but at least they are using the same processes, and here concerning the context, they are also profiting from this very similar situation. And yes, then they are using vernacular writing in order to present themselves as the defenders of an oppressed population, oppressed by elites which are using a foreign language. And so and through that, they are presenting themselves as the defender of the nation. But at least what we want is to consolidate their power, but you have all this construction in order to realize that. And in two countries with different, we can say that they are really very different. Brabant is a very urbanized country. The Bohemia is marked by the domination of the nobility. So two radically different countries, polities, but at least the same mechanisms are used by these two different groups.
So circling back to where we started, what would you think we should see medieval nation as? What is medieval nation then?
So maybe I will be a little bit provocative. I would say that medieval nation is not so different as actual nation. So I'm provocating when I'm saying that. But what is important is that the medieval nation is an imagined community. We have to be aware of that. So I'm quoting here Anderson. And that means that it's a constructed project. The nation does not exist for itself. And here we had, for instance, these two literary projects by Dalimil and by Boendel, so in Bohemia and in Brabant. And it is a representation, another representation by a given community. And here, so the Czechs or the Brabantines. But what is important is that here we are aware of these processes of construction, but nations present themselves as natural. And here I would like to quote Susan Reynolds, who wrote that nations are natural, given objectively existing human communities, each of which is assumed not only to have its own common culture, myth, history, and destiny, but also to be, and it is very important, a political community with a right to what is called self-determination. So the medieval nation was already political, and it's something which is, according to me, very important, in which the traditional historiography tended to forget or to avoid. The tendency was to resume the medieval nation to only cultural, historical, identical elements, so that is at least ethnicity, and all these sources, on the contrary, show how the medieval nation was already very political. It was already an instrumentalization for some groups to get power, but in doing so, these groups diffuse the idea of nation and at least impose a kind of definition of the nations. The nation is also based on a strong belief in its objectivity. So the belief is something which is also very important to define the nation. It's not only these different elements, so that is these cultural, ethnical, and political elements, but it's also, you have to create a belief. The nation exists because some individuals decided to identify in it. And here, that is why these political aspects are so important. The nation is a project that has to be attracting, and it works only if it involves the individuals. And that's why also another very important element to define the medieval nation is the camaraderie, to take also a word used by Anderson, and this idea that the different individuals are not anymore only subjects, but also a part of the decision making. And that's why the medieval nation is fundamentally political.
this doesn't sound as alien to us as we would imagine. Thank you very much for this very thought-provoking discussion. I hope to see you soon.
Thank you very much.